so I guess this means that we are officially starting the session. Excellent. So we are going to have 3 papers and an hour and a half. So I would say 20 minutes per paper, or 20-25 minutes per paper. We leave 5 minutes for discussion. Would that sound, does that sound good? Okay, and I apologize, but when I logged in, I lost the program. So I actually don't know who is scheduled first. If you give me 1 second, I should be able to find it. Friday. Economic theory. Here it is. Okay, so Roni is going to be our first speaker. And Roni is going to talk about creativity and social organization. All right. Good. Roni, the floor is yours.
It's not even 4:30 yet, so maybe we want to give a chance for folks to show up, or do we want to just start?
My watch. My watch it is 4:30. Yeah.
Yeah, just turned 30. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, we can start. Okay, so I'm gonna share the screen for a second. Okay. Okay. So can everyone see the screen okay? Yeah, okay. Sorry about this. So we all prepared in sec. I didn't think I was going first. So okay. So I'm sorry to rush. You've already heard an iteration of this paper not so long ago. So yes, my project is looking into Frank Knight's theory of the entrepreneur, and specifically, it's focusing on one specific element of this theory, which I always found peculiar, and so I wanted to take a deeper dive there, and that's this one key point that Knight makes, which says that the essence of mentality from a functional standpoint seems to be its forward-facing, its forward-looking character. And this does a lot of work in the theory, and it seems completely unfounded, or he doesn't provide too much sources for this claim. And this claim is very, very important. Not only is human consciousness forward-facing, but what we end up learning is that basically our entire social, economic, and political arrangements are also fundamentally future-oriented, by which I mean that we structure our society, our political arrangements on a certain priority of the future. And I can get more into that in the Q&A, but I really think still today, 100 years later, we very much can talk about a society that's very future-oriented, an idea of welfare that is very future-oriented because it's founded on insurance and so on, and a big social concern about uncertainty, as we, I think, all felt very viscerally in the last 2 years, the destructive power of uncertainty, and to what an extent our institutions are meant to kind of combat this uncertainty. So for me, Knight is, I have been working on Knight for a while, but this is one of the major added values of his theory, is that it allows us to really think about what it means to have a political system that is kind of future oriented. And so this basic idea goes back to a certain strand of evolutionary psychology. That's what I show in the paper, and especially this kind of the evolutionary psychology that goes all the way back to Herbert Spencer is mediated in Knight's work through the pragmatists, the American pragmatists, And so the pragmatists, of course, took some of these evolutionary theory ideas, psychology ideas, and they make them into also an ethical method. So it goes beyond epistemology. And I think Knight draws on all of these ideas in a pretty straightforward way. So also kind of, there's a lot of talk about how Knight has this, is a critic of the pragmatists, or maybe has only a conversion later in life that makes him more of a pragmatist. And I actually think there is so much overlap between Knight and the pragmatist that is straightforward and very early, as this account shows. So what I'd say in the paper is that Knight doesn't just draw on the pragmatists. Some of the ideas that he's bringing from the pragmatists come into conflict with his liberal commitments, especially since this evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology story really tells us a story about natural selection into leadership roles. Entrepreneurs, specifically in Knight's account, are selected according to fit with a future-oriented, uncertain world. And this puts into question the basic idea of the consent of the governed, right? So if leaders are selected into their roles because they're naturally fitter, where does voluntarism and consent come into the picture? So this is by way of introduction. I hope all of these things will be clearer as I go forward. Sorry, I actually didn't start my timer, but this shouldn't be longer than 15 minutes. And so Knight, I will show, resolves this tension by emphasizing this idea of responsible direction. Maybe anyone who's as a reader of Knight has read this phrase often and maybe speaks of it often, but what does it really mean? I think responsible direction, the idea that responsibility is a big part of what it means to be an entrepreneur, is the kind of the way Knight resolves these inner tensions in his theory. This is by way of introduction. Let me get a bit deeper into all of these different parts of the argument. And so I don't know how many people here are not familiar with Knight's distinction of risk and uncertainty, but very, very briefly, right? Knight is very famous for establishing this distinction between risk, which is everything that is calculable, predictable, insurable about the future, and therefore completely compatible with equilibrium analysis, and is a matter of technocratic management, right? So not a big problem. Risk is really one of the ways we've tamed uncertainty, whereas uncertainty really is all that is inherently unknowable, uninsurable, unclassifiable about the future. And so because we have uncertainty beyond the regular economic actors, we have entrepreneurs. These are slightly different actors. They bear the uncertainty in society, which means they will assume the losses of any enterprise, but they will also gain its profits. It's a very, very brief summary of Knight's theory of the entrepreneur. But as far as this paper is concerned, my question is, but who are these entrepreneurs? How are they selected? How are they chosen? This is a question that Knight answers quite extensively in the book. And the question is, what is this? What is his answer? What is it based on? Sorry. The answer comes from evolutionary biology for Knight, and it is something like this. The essence of mentality from a functional standpoint seems to be its forward-looking character. That's the quote I started with. Life has been described as internal adaptations to external coexistences and sequences. The fundamental difference in the case of animal or conscious life is that it can react to a situation before that situation materializes. It can see things coming. This is what the whole complicated mechanism of the nervous system is for. In the biological sense, the farther ahead the organism can see, the more adequately it can adapt itself, the more fully and competently it can live. All right, so what is consciousness? Right, consciousness is that thing, that organ that we have developed so that we can anticipate danger and not just respond to it when it is already there. That is the basic answer, and it is kind of annoyingly lacks any kind of direct references where we can go and see where Knight is getting these ideas. Right, so to summarize this idea, human consciousness is the result of our evolving ability to anticipate danger. And what this has meant practically today is that we have different kinds of personalities around us, and all of them can be kind of classified according to how people respond to danger and how what their attitude is towards the unknown future. And so out of all of this, and Knight offers like a very interesting elaborate typology of humankind, and he comes up with this formula that gives us who will likely become an entrepreneur. And yes, it will be someone who is pretty good at predicting future trends and planning ahead, but it will also be someone who has enough self-confidence and kind of a gambling spirit and a love of the game and a willingness to act on their speculation. So there's a certain type, and that type is best suited to become an entrepreneur. And so in answer to the question, how does leadership get chosen in society, right? This is the answer is leadership is selected, is naturally or semi-naturally selected, right? And Knight calls this a process of social civilization. When uncertainty is present and the task of deciding what to do and how to do it takes the ascendancy over that of execution, the internal organization of the productive groups is no longer a matter of indifference or mechanical detail, right? So Knight has this consistent trope where he tells us if we didn't have uncertainty, human beings would basically be completely automatic in their behavior. They would be optimizing creatures, and everything about what they do will be kind of dictated by the optimal outcome, right? And so leadership would be just a matter of superior skill, for example. But once we have uncertainty present, things change, and we have to centralize, right? So Knight has an argument that basically says hierarchy and centralization are the result of the presence of uncertainty. And so we need to centralize this deciding and controlling function. A process of cephalization, such as is taking place in the evolution of organic life, is inevitable for the same reasons. Right? So we will have concentration of the deciding and judging function. Now, I argue that this idea conflicts with Knight's basic liberal premises about choice and the consent of the governed. He doesn't want to come up with a theory, because such a big part of having a theory of uncertainty is to say that not everything we do is automatic, and not all of our choices are kind of dictated by our base needs and our optimizing rationalizing mind. He doesn't want to end up with a picture that says, well, entrepreneurs are just selected into their roles. And I think this is a fundamental problem for his theory. Entrepreneurs gain power and authority over others. This is a very important point that Knight makes, and one that I believe makes his theory so much more interesting than Cose's on why we have corporations. So their natural selection threatens the legitimacy of this power. So to get at how Knight then gives us a solution to this problem, I took this deeper dive into his supposed sources. I read primarily one book that is cited in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, but is not cited in this specific context, and that's the book Creative Intelligence, which is a collaborative book that Dewey kind of wrote the preface for, but then has several other key figures in the kind of early pragmatist movement from 14, but I'm not sure, it could be 1919. And so what I show is that Knight and the pragmatists, despite a lot of talk about an antagonism between Knight and the pragmatists, they actually share a very broad agenda in common. Like the pragmatist, Knight is very concerned with the nature of human experience, the source of meaning and value in human life. They both reject reductive views of human experience in the behavioral sciences, so the reduction of all human experience to kind of instinct and a kind of the material, physical substrate of human life. Both reject instrumentalist views of social institutions. Both look to link the material substrate of human experience with their higher faculties. So they are anti-dualists. They don't want to have an account that completely separates the life of the mind from our material life. And so they need to come up with some kind of synthetic account, right? And that's why theory of consciousness becomes so important. And both emphasize our future orientation. So so I argue basically that this strong emphasis on the future orientation really comes from this engagement with the pragmatists. And it's the pragmatists and not, for instance, Herbert Spencer, because what the pragmatists do to Herbert Spencer is make him future oriented. I think a lot of Herbert Spencer's kind of evolutionary biology is focused on the imprint of the past, right? On the imprint of past generations and how that informs, that literally shapes our neural makeup and shapes our reactions. The pragmatists put the emphasis on the future. And I think this quote really brings it to the fore, right? For the pragmatists, it's not just about how is our consciousness created, how important is the future for explaining how the mind works. It really is a complete revolution in how we think of metaphysics, how we think of epistemology, how we think of ethics. It's a counter move to the history of philosophy, right? Which always had a much stronger emphasis on the past than the future. The past is a body of knowledge that we refer back to, and the pragmatists are reversing all of that, right? So anticipation is more primary than recollection. This is Dewey. Projections and summoning of the past. Given a world like that in which we live, and a world in which environing changes are partly favorable and partly callously indifferent, experience is bound to be prospective in import. For any control attainable by the living creature depends upon what is done to alter the state of things. Success and failure are the primary categories of life. Hope and anxiety are dominant qualities of experience. And so the kind of pragmatist epistemology that you can read about in that collection of essays is really an experimental way of knowing, right? We move in the world deciphering incomplete signals, which physically move us as we seek a more complete picture. And the easiest example of that is when we hear a sound that surprises us, but we don't know its source, so we will move and we'll look out the window, for example, to see what the source is of the sound and get a bigger picture. But I really like this other example, which is in another essay in the collection, right? A baseball player sees the ball not simply as an approaching object, but as a ball to be caught and then thrown to first base. Moreover, the ball, while still on its way, is a ball that may be bound to the right or the left, right? So our impressions are necessarily blurred, incomplete, and everything we do is about kind of getting a better picture. And this was, of course, extended into kind of an ethical method, right? We approach ethics as an experimental way of being in the world rather than a collection of precepts and rules. That is kind of the basic picture, the resource that Knight is engaging with. And so I think what Knight is doing with this basic set of ideas is asking what happens when we are experimenting together, right? When we are no longer talking about the individual experiencing the world, but when we're talking about people coming together and collaborating on projects that also require a lot of this kind of experimentation, that have a lot of uncertainty in them. And I like this quote from Bode because I think you can already kind of hear why it's problematic to extend this ethics to a collaborative project, right? A perceived object is a stimulus. So this is very technical, a very technical quote in psychology. A perceived object is a stimulus which controls or directs the organism by results which have not yet occurred, but which will or may occur in the future. Right? The uniqueness of such a stimulus lies in the fact that a contingent result somehow becomes operative as a present fact. The future is transferred into the present so as to become effective in the guidance of behavior. So that's all well and good when it's a sound and I'm getting to the window, but if we remember Knight's account of social civilization, in essence, what is happening in collaborative projects is that a single person, right, becomes a single person becomes the right? The image is deciphered for some, by some for the sake of others who lack a similar kind of judgment or agency, right? So we're actually limiting this function of being attentive to the future, of allowing the future to control the present in all of these ways. This becomes the job of some people, but not others. And only those people are now living in this world where they exert judgment and act, have the authority to guide action based on these images from the future. Right, so again, this kind of sharpens this problem of who those people are, that they were just naturally selected rather than democratically elected to do this very important function. And so that's, all right, so this is just a reminder, right, the centralization of the deciding and controlling function. So this is why Knight really introduces this concept of responsible control. He makes it any assumption of entrepreneurial authority, any assumption of this entrepreneurial position is always predicated on the consent of those who are going to be governed by it, who have to basically be convinced, right? They have to be convinced by the leadership of the entrepreneur, and they have to be convinced that the entrepreneur's guarantees are valid, right, and that they will be respected, right? So this idea that responsibility frames this relationship is very, very important in resolving those kind of issues with natural selection. And so with human nature as we know it, it would be impracticable or very unusual for one man to guarantee to another a definite result of the latter's actions without being given power. On the other hand, the second party would not place himself under the direction of the first without such a guarantee. The result is a double contract of the type famous in the history of the evasion of usury laws. I'm still kind of puzzling over this double contract, but to me, this says that Knight has an idea of the social contract. One side takes responsibility and assumes the authority, and the other side consents to this arrangement, but there's always a regular payoff, right? Profit is also moving in the direction of the entrepreneurs, and I think that might be what is implied in this double contract. So to conclude, the meaning of an experimental method in society and in collaborative projects is the assumption of responsibility for the results of experimentation, not just for oneself, but for others. And that's the essence not only of the wage and interest contract, but of the social contract itself. And the assumption of responsibility is the basis of the legitimacy of the entrepreneurial system and of the modern corporation as a hierarchical instrument of economic planning and risk management. And I'll just end with this wonderful quote, right? Because it helps kind of sharpen this point that Knight is very committed to substantive human agency in the face of uncertainty. And so he says it's interesting to observe that the common applications of probability in games of chance relate to some action of the human organism itself, the drawing of a card from a deck or a ball from an urn, the impulse given to a wheel or a coin or a die, if there is real indeterminateness, and if the ultimate seed of it is in the activities of the human machine, there is in a sense an opening of the door to conception of freedom in conduct, right? So the idea that a human action is somehow involved in triggering these games of chance. I think here it's a very symbolic and ironic idea of agency, but I think we can really look at the entire project in risk, uncertainty, and profit as an effort to make this a very substantive point, that there really is the seed of this indeterminateness is in the activities of the human machine. All right, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Roni. I think we have a few minutes for questions, if there's any. Maybe you want to raise your hand and I can call on you, or you can just unmute yourself and speak. Ross.
Hi, Roni, and thanks for the revisions. It looking better and better as you go along. Your presentation today reminded me of a couple things you might want to look at. The last paper I did in 2021 for the centenary of the book is a paper that focused on the last chapter, which has often been ignored, and links it to a paper that he wrote just before publishing Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. The paper is called Social Organization. And of course, that's a title of the first chapter, well, a different, slightly different title of the first chapter of the Economic Organization, which has the title Social Economic Organization. But this is an early draft of that chapter. And I think you'll find a lot of themes in that connect, that even further reinforce the notion that, especially as Knight is revising Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit from his original dissertation, that the themes you're talking about are quite present. And then just to link it to work he did later, again, these are unpublished papers. Often, as you know, the best stuff is in the unpublished stuff. And so there's a 1927 essay called Forms of Association. I have to say it was selfishly motivated. He argues that even marriage should probably be a 5-year contract and not a permanent contract. This is right before he divorces his wife and marries another woman. So there's a little bit of self-interest at stake in the argument. But then his second wife, he and Ethel were writing a book during the 1920s called Work, Art, and Play. And of course, those themes just sound so much like, you know, sort of a Knightian kind of pragmatism. So I just suggest those to you as things to kind of, maybe not for this paper, but for continued work on these themes. They'd be pretty interesting for you.
Are they in the Iowa book?
Are they what? Yeah, I think at least one or two of them are. For sure, the second and the Forms of Association and Work, Art, and Play, I think, are. Work, Art, and Play, I don't know that it actually exists as a manuscript. He was collecting a whole bunch of stuff. So the stuff that's in the Iowa book is one of the reasons I made all that available, is because it's just, there's so much on these themes. And then Social Organization is certainly available in the Knight papers.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, then we may move to David with the Pax Marcel. I don't know how to pronounce it. So David, maybe you can pronounce your title for me. I think you need to unmute yourself first. You're still muted.
All right,
David.
now I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Is this really this? I think I. All right. Let's see. Now I'm not completely at home with this technology, so let's see if I can figure it out. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Why can't I see it? Oh, it's probably over here. All right. I think I'm ready then. Well, I'm so glad to be here. But you can see it. You can see the screen. Okay. So I'm so happy to be here. Friends, colleagues, it's so nice to see you all. I so look forward to a time when we can meet again in person and have these discussions, and the dinner and the reception and lunch and everything. So, all right, so enough of that. I'll just get started, I guess. So No. All right. So in, all right. Sorry, little, I'll get this right. Just give me a minute. Okay, so in his obituary of Alfred Marshall, and I say Marshallana, it's mostly about Smith. The name of the title is bad, but it's about Marshall's interpretation of Smith. So in his obituary of Alfred Marshall, John Maynard Keynes distinguished two different ways of reading Marshall's principles. Uninitiated readers, he claimed, taken in by the understated tone, Spartan style, and apparent absence of controversy or novelty, would tend to perceive the book as somewhat mundane, clear, apt, and humane exposition of fairly obvious matters. Keynes cited with approval an unsigned review from The Guardian, presenting what can be viewed as an initiated reading, calling out Marshall for hiding his own originality. So the book has two aspects. This is the principles. On one hand, it's an honest and obstinate endeavor to find out the truth. On the other hand, it's an ingenious attempt to disclaim any credit for discovering it on the ground that it was all implicitly contained in the works of earlier writers. So the review, in the politest terms, and I think we can attribute this to Keynes, accuses Marshall of practicing a kind of deception, concealing his own innovations by disguising them as elements of the classical theory of Smith and Ricardo. And I want to argue that Marshall's theory of normal price presents a case of this ingenious attempt to disclaim novelty, implying that his normal price refers to the same price that Smith called natural price. So in a famous passage, Marshall wrote, "This is the real drift of that much quoted and much misunderstood doctrine of Adam Smith and other economists, that the normal or natural value of a commodity is that which economic forces tend to bring about in the long run. It's the average value which economic forces would bring about if the general conditions of life were stationary for a run of time long enough to enable them all to work out their full effect." This passage is presented to the uninitiated reader as a straightforward clarification of Smith's doctrine that the natural value is the value economic forces tend to bring about in the long run. The clarification is fairly trivial, but while Marshall allows the need for minor clarification of the meaning of Smith's doctrine, he leaves no room to doubt his assertion that it was, in fact, Smith's doctrine that natural price is the price that results in the long run. Marshall claims not simply that this doctrine of Smith's was well known, but that it had been much quoted. Guess what? It wasn't. You can't find it anywhere. Nobody's quoted it because it doesn't exist. Digital searching allows us to know for sure. But Smith didn't say this. Maybe he said it in some other way. We'll get to that. So as such, the claim that this was Smith's doctrine could hardly be open to question or deserving of scrutiny. The uninitiated reader is ready to move on. The initiated reader, however, recognizes that normal price as the long-run price is Marshall's innovation, and that the attribution to Smith is intended to conceal its novelty. This is not in itself a criticism of Marshall's theory of normal price. On the contrary, both Keynes and the anonymous reviewer seem to have accepted it. And it's not my purpose here to criticize Marshall's theory of normal price. The problem that I'm interested in with Marshall's strategy of concealing his novelties by attributing them to classical writers is that it is bound to give a distorted picture of the ideas of classical writers. In particular, the success of Marshall's substitution of normal price for natural price has meant that Smith's central concept of natural price, and one might say the entire classical standpoint, have been submerged and forgotten, to use Sraffa's words. So I'm working on a book to argue that although the term natural may well have become unsuitable, and there are reasons for giving up the word natural and give the term natural price, but that Marshall's term normal price fails altogether to capture what Smith meant by natural price. I propose that Smith understood nature in a very old sense, one that's still with us, perhaps the most important sense in the history of Europe. From the 13th century to the 19th century, natural philosophy provided the framework for scientific inquiry in European universities based on the idea of nature as an inner source of motion with connotations of birth, life, and growth. Smith wrote in the idiom of natural philosophy prevalent in his day. Natural price for Smith, we might expect, would be a reproduction price, a price that allows for the ongoing existence, the life, the growth of the market. This would be the price, as Smith says, that allows sellers to continue their business. Or as Sraffa says, the price that makes it possible for the price to be repeated. So in this chapter, this is a opening chapter, and it's really focused on Marshall's actual substitution. I'll get to in a later chapter, which I won't discuss much today, I'll get to this alternative idea of nature and why it makes sense in what Smith wrote, why it's consistent with what Smith wrote. But here I will focus on Marshall's substitution. So when Marshall was, and why he adopted this bizarre rhetorical strategy of concealing his innovations as things belonging to the classicals. So when Marshall was inaugurated as professor of political economy at Cambridge in 1885, political economy stood very low in public opinion. Marshall's mentor, Henry Sidgwick, became concerned that the decline in public confidence in political economy would undermine its authority in policy debates. And he argued that the root of the problem lay in the controversy among supposed experts. I'm going ahead here. So the differences which have subsisted among the most eminent of its professors have proved exceedingly unfavorable to its progress and have generated a disposition to distrust its best established conclusions. And a variety of criticisms had been raised against classical political economy over the course of the 19th century from socialists, humanists, historicists, sociologists, and marginalists. So Sidgwick set out to raise the standing of political economy by explaining these criticisms away on the grounds that they're based on misunderstandings, that there's really no basis for controversy, only needless polemics. So my primary aim then is to eliminate unnecessary controversy by stating classical results in a more guarded manner with due attention to the criticisms of suggested writers. Marshall adopted Sidgwick's cause and did a much better job with it, the cause of raising the status of political economy, and really made it his life's work. He was more ambitious than Sidgwick, and his pioneering role in the professionalization of economics has been well documented, for example, in John Maloney's The Professionalization of Economics. Marshall minimized controversy by addressing these criticisms that had been raised, but always in a manner designed to end rather than prolong debate. His responses to the critics of various sorts of political economy followed a consistent pattern. He would praise the critics for their contributions, acknowledging the strengths of their arguments and conceding the limitations, the lack of clarity, and the minor forgivable deficiencies of classical writers, but denying that the criticisms had any real damaging effect when directed against the core principles of the classical theory properly understood. So the controversies were, as Sidgwick had claimed, unnecessary, the result of needless confusion, the relevant points having been contained implicit within the classical theory all along. Now, Cliff Leslie, Thomas Edward Cliff Leslie made a criticism of the theory of nature in classical political economy that was a little different. Leslie attacked the idea of nature pervasive in Smith's writings and adopted by Ricardo, which informs the central concepts of classical political economy. Natural price, natural liberty, the natural rates of income distribution. Leslie claimed that Smith shared the idea of the physiocrats, presupposing an inherently harmonious natural order of things which appears wherever nature is left to itself. So I won't read this whole quote, but I think that's basically what it says. And Leslie considered the assumption of a harmonious order to be no more than a superstition from the Dark Ages, a fiction of ancient philosophy of no intellectual value or interest, a scholastic blot on Smith's reputation. Insofar as Smith's theory depended entirely on this fiction, Leslie believed that the whole artifice could simply be dismissed, and that was the course he recommended. Marshall's strategy of minimizing controversy by blaming misunderstanding doesn't quite apply in the same way as it did to the other criticisms. Nature clearly does play a major role in Smith's writings. Following the patterns, Marshall agreed with Leslie, conceded Leslie's point that Smith's idea of nature came from the physiocrats. Don't think that's true. presupposing a harmonious natural order with free market prices serving as the prices of that harmonious order, prices both natural and good, to which people ought to let markets conform. But Marshall nevertheless managed to construe Leslie's criticism in such a way that it could be dismissed as easily if it had been based on a misunderstanding. According to Marshall, Smith's physiocratic idea of natural order conflated two different kinds of propositions. And that's what's in the quote here. Smith had not quite got rid of the confusion prevalent in his time between the laws of economic science and the ethical precept of conformity to nature. Natural with him sometimes means that which existing forces actually produce or tend to produce, sometimes that which his own human nature makes him wish they should produce. Of course, Marshall provides no support for these slanders. Marshall minimizes Smith's culpability, claiming that the problematic confusion was common in his time, yet in the end concedes that Smith had made a real mistake. But by construing the problem as a confusion of two different principles, Marshall was able to solve the problem as if it were just a simple misunderstanding, because with this supposed confusion of these two different principles, all it was necessary to do was to embrace the one, the positive theory, and reject the other, the normative piece. And so by just substituting normal price for natural price, Marshall seems to have solved the problem. Remarkably, Marshall offered no explanation or justification why this would be a good substitution. Substitution is not obvious or self-evident, and there are a number of reasons. God, why did I do that? There are a number of reasons to be suspicious of it. Keynes suggested that, that Marshall was indifferent, excuse me, to what other writers such as Smith had actually said. Literally, that their explicit statements and reasonings were irrelevant. That's where I need this. It was an essential truth to which Marshall held firmly, that those individuals who are endowed with a special genius for subject and powerful economic intuition will often be more right in their conclusions than in their explanations and explicit statements. Their intuitions will be in advance of their terminology and analysis. And it's dishonorable to pester their memories with criticisms of their words. Or even more directly, earlier, Keynes, according to Marshall, earlier writers of repute must be held to have meant what is right and reasonable, whatever they may have said. Well, it's not implausible to think that Smith's intuitions could be in advance of his analysis and terminology. The problem Marshall leaves unexplained is how he knows what Smith's intuitions, presumptions, or scheme of thought are without relying on his explicit statements. Marshall held that his own theory was right and reasonable, which would seem to imply that Smith, for example, it should be assumed that Smith held Marshall's theory despite anything that Smith might have said. All right, the unusual approach, the history of economic thought. But this is the result of Marshall's rhetorical approach, which forced him to ignore what Smith actually wrote when it was inconsistent with his efforts to conceal his originality by attributing his innovations to Smith. His desire to reduce controversy, professionalize economics, raise its status was a higher priority than producing an interpretation of Smith that had anything to do with Smith's actual writings. So let's look at some examples of where Marshall is just completely indifferent to what Smith says. First of all, you could the produce of labor in the beginning of chapter 8, opening sentence of chapter 8 of The Wealth of Nations. The produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor is among the most obvious and striking examples in which Marshall simply ignores what Smith's words are that are inconsistent with Marshall's substitution. If we repeat Marshall's substitution of normal for natural in this case, it would imply that the produce of labor is the normal wage of labor. But this was not any more true in Smith's time than today. Marshall's substitution just doesn't make any sense in this case. Perhaps Smith used nature in different senses in these two cases, but Marshall would have to explain that. Evidently, he's just indifferent to what Smith actually wrote. I think the system of natural liberty is another case where it just doesn't make sense. But one of the most extraordinary cases is this attribution of Smith of the physiocratic natural order. I mean, as is well known, there's a long passage criticizing Kane on precisely this point in The Wealth of Nations. Smith argued that, as with health regimens for human beings, there are various different orders of society might take and still be prosperous, not one unique natural order. If there's no unique natural order, then there's not a natural order in the sense of the physiocrats. I mean, there's just no evidence that Smith really held this. Again, Marshall simply ignores what Smith actually wrote. The other one that's really odd is where to say that Smith confused scientific laws with the ethical precept of conformity to nature. It's hard to know what this would mean. I mean, I just personally, I have a hard time wrapping my head around what it might possibly mean to say that someone confused scientific law with an ethical, like scientific laws with one ethical precept. I don't know. I just can't make any sense of it. Even more importantly, I think Marshall fails to consider, totally disregards what Smith actually wrote about the relationship between natural prices and market prices. Smith discussed 4 cases, and let's see, first, agricultural fluctuations due to weather and climate and uncontrollable things. Agricultural outputs increase or decrease year by year, fluctuate around a certain level, but they don't reach in the long run. The market prices don't reach the natural prices. They never do. In this case, the short run market prices never have conformed to long run prices. There's no temporary persistent time structure. And I've skipped over most of that. That's what the normal, I think the normal, I'm assuming the normal price concept is fairly familiar, that it's, for Marshall, it's a question of temporary versus persistent things. And this agricultural fluctuation just doesn't have that structure in any way. Smith talks about particular accidents. And here he's talking about secrets in trade and manufacturer, which he suggests might last longer than a single lifetime. This is due to differences in knowledge among producers. And secrets may be fleeting, but they may persist. Marshall's distinction just between persistent causes and fleeting temporary causes doesn't apply. There's just no inherent temporal structure. Similarly, among deviations resulting from natural causes, which may, Smith says, continue to operate forever, Smith discusses wines grown on scarce land, the market prices of which may deviate from their natural prices for whole centuries together. The market price of certain French wines is higher than the natural price. For Smith, this remains a deviation of market price from natural price, even though it continues potentially forever. In this case, the normal price, as Marshall defined it, is not the competitive price, because the monopoly over the vineyard land is a persistent rather than fleeting condition. So Marshall's normal price in this case is greater than Smith's natural price. Given this difference, Marshall might have concluded that his idea of normal price was simply a different price concept from Smith's natural price, but he didn't. Marshall ignored what Smith said as if it were irrelevant. He insisted that natural price and normal price were the same, and that they were not necessarily equal to the competitive price. This would seem to imply that Smith misunderstood profoundly his own central concept, kind of an extraordinary possibility. But again, Marshall's normal price is not equal to Smith's natural price, exactly because Marshall's time structure is irrelevant to Smith's concerns. And finally, the deviations resulting from particular regulations of police, including monopolies, exclusive privileges of corporations, and statutes of apprenticeship, may last as long as the regulations of police which give occasion to them. Such policies lead to deviations of market prices from natural prices, but in ways that have nothing to do with the persistence or fleetingness of causes or Marshall's short period, long period distinction. Policies of the sort Smith raises may continue for short periods or long periods. There's just no systematic temporal structure. So this raises, to conclude then, I hope at least raises the possibility, maybe the likelihood, that Marshall's substitution of normal price for natural price was driven not by an attempt to faithfully represent Smith's view, but it was driven by Marshall's primary concern, the task of building economics into a science. And so, but given the questions about the substitution, I hope it seems reasonable to consider the possibility that Smith meant something else. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. Let's open thanks. Let's open to questions, if there are any from the floor.
So compelling.
I think Nicola has a question, please.
No, it was just to ask Dave to elaborate a little bit on what he just said at the end. So why all this, way of interpreting Smith that you showed us was completely.
So Marshall was trying to minimize controversy. He didn't like this idea of nature. The whole idea of nature, I think, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It sounds scholastic and medieval and supernatural. It's funny that natural sounds supernatural. Smith talks about the purposes of nature. For example, I think Marshall was he lived in a period when the Dark Ages was still a really strong idea, and he just rejected anything that smelled even a little bit of 18th century or before. I think Marshall just wanted to have nothing to do with it. And I think some people want to wash their hands of natural price today because the idea of nature is sort of threatening because it's so weird. So Marshall wanted to get rid of the idea of nature. Leslie had attributed this I think preposterous idea that Smith shared, the physiocrat's idea of nature. But this was also Marshall could manage his substitution. It seems to me that what's really going on is that Smith meant something completely different. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, it's really an older idea of nature that Smith was thinking in terms of the idea of nature that goes with natural philosophy. And so Marshall has pulled a hoax. He's persuaded, because his substitution of normal long run price for natural price has been widely accepted. But what I'm suggesting is that it's completely misleading, and that instead of seeing Smith's natural price as a normal price, the way Marshall suggested, that what it really is, that the idea of nature, the old idea of nature, and still today, has to do with birth and growth and life, what keeps things continuing to exist. This is the sort of the basis of Aristotle's idea of nature, that things must always be actively pursuing their continued existence. I think it makes much more sense to read. I think if you develop that idea and then look at what Smith wrote, I think it makes much better sense of what Smith wrote than this idea of natural price. And it gives rise to an idea of price that's like, I think like Persraffa's price in production of commodities, the price that allows the process of production and consumption to go on, to continue over time. So I hope that answered your question.
John.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much, David. Also, I think in Smith, and you could take this different directions, but one could also say that natural price presumes that the natural factor returns, natural rent, natural profit, natural wages obtained. And, we know that he thought that wasn't the case for most of European history. So that can be, argued about, but that's one possible way of interpreting Smith that would push his natural prices quite far away from normal prices, though you could object to that interpretation.
No, I agree completely. I mean, the prices are the cost of production, because prices are equal to cost of production, including profit, because those are the things that keep people in the market. Smith says, I think a few times, right? If the price should slip below the natural price, if the market price slips below the natural price, then the market won't be sustained. Someone will withdraw. Someone won't get paid. Someone will withdraw. The market will cease to exist, or cease to exist on the same scale. It's especially clear, I think, with the subsistence wage. The subsistence wage is the natural wage, the wage that keeps people alive, it keeps them living, keeps them continuing to exist over time. And so, but the same thing is true of profits and rent. The rate of profits keeps the master, the capitalist, whatever we're calling this person in the market. The rent is what keeps the landlord there. If the market price falls below the natural price, someone doesn't get paid and withdraws. The natural price keeps people there, keeps the market going. And that's what nature means, that in its oldest sense. Actually, the first, if you look at the ancient Greece, and the earliest sense is really this idea of nature as life, as birth, as growth, as ongoing existence, and it's central to Aristotle's idea of nature. So I think that's exactly right. That in those cases, he does say that the rates of distribution are the typical rates, but they're what keep the people in the market, keep the market going. He says that the natural price is what it's really worth to the seller. I mean, the seller is the one who keeps it going. The seller is the one who keeps showing up with the stuff to sell, and it's the seller that, to keep the market going, the price has to be good enough for the seller. And so I think that supports this interpretation of giving a natural price as well.
Any other questions? I'm going to actually ask you a question, Dave, because it puzzled me, part of the logic that you explained at the very end, that Marshall wanted to get away from the idea of natural because it was too unscientific, and instead the idea of normal is more scientific. And it's difficult for me to see how normality can be the base of science. And I don't know if you understand what I'm asking.
I'm not sure, but I share the concern. I think normality doesn't really mean anything. Opposite things can be normal. It's just a very vague and loose idea that it works well because it sounds sort of like natural. You could slip it in, and there is a sense of natural that sounds a lot like normal. You can use, there's some cases where you can use them indifferently, but I agree with you that normal is the basis of a scientific theory. I mean, you don't see anything like that I don't think in physics or chemistry or biology. And it just seems like it's just much to me, it seems like it's much too vague a concept. I mean, both high prices and low prices, both cold and hot, both, anything totally opposite things can be normal. And just for it being just the idea of normality doesn't really tell us all that much. So I think I'm in agreement.
Maybe I can say something. Maybe normality comes from mathematics and statistics. So maybe normal in this way is more relevant.
I don't think that's how Marshall uses normality. For him, normality is just whatever's normal. I mean, I mean, in mathematics, maybe in physics too, I guess there are ideas of normalization. You can use I mean, a norm-giving idea of normality, but I don't think, I mean, for Marshall, it's really just kind of whatever happens to result from the persistent causes. And I don't, I mean, so I think you're right. I don't disagree that maybe there are these concepts of normality, but I don't see it in Marshall in any way.
I guess we leave it with this question on the what is normal and what is scientifically normal, and we go to Nicola, who is going to talk to us about the Chicago School and the irrelevance of predation.
Yes, thank you, Maria. I try to share the screen. Okay. Can you see it? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so as you can see, I slightly changed the title, the Chicago School and the irrelevance of predation. I start with a rather well-known quotation from a decision by the US Supreme Court in 1986. This is the quotation. There is a consensus among commentators that predatory pricing schemes are rarely tried and even more rarely successful. This quotation was taken almost verbatim from a paper by John McGee, who was a Chicago scholar and who wrote more or less this sentence in a 1980 paper. And this quotation came in a decision by the Supreme Court that was filled with quotations from references to Chicago law and economic scholars like McGee himself, Bork, Easterbrook. Indeed, this decision is considered one of the symbols of Chicago's success in shaping American antitrust law since the late 1970s, especially with respect to the so-called exclusionary practices, or what you can call monopolization, what goes under the Section 2 of the Sherman Act, the antitrust law in the US. The point is, why predatory pricing in particular? I mean, I've published quite a few works on predatory pricing, but it never came to my mind to try to figure out why specifically predatory pricing was so important. If you wish to deserve this place of honor in one of the most important Supreme Court decision establishing the Chicago approach to antitrust as the law of the land. The paper argues that predatory pricing is a sort of red thread in the history of post-World War II Chicago antitrust law and economics. And this is why I slightly changed the title, because in my view, predatory pricing is relevant because it was irrelevant. And this is what I'm going to explain to you today. Predatory pricing played a strategic role in Chicago's assault against established antitrust case law. Dismissing predatory pricing did not so matter so much per se. You may even think that predatory pricing is not so important as an antitrust violation. I mean, there are other kinds of exclusionary practices that are much more frequent, so much more common. Just think of any exclusionary practice related to distribution, for example, that are much more frequent than predatory pricing. So dismissing predatory pricing did not matter so much in itself, but rather because dismissing this opened a crucial breach in the antitrust wall built by 1950s and 1960s proactive enforcers. So predatory pricing was really instrumental to Chicago's strategy against established antitrust law. This is a picture from 1953, and the three protagonists of my story are the three guys with the name in red. So Bork, McGee, and of course our own director. Let's start from, of course, from director. As you probably know, he was the head of the Chicago law and economics approach. He was a very important figure in the history of the Chicago Law and Economics School. Our director in the 1950s had a very specific goal. He wanted to prevent or demolish, depending on whether the Warren Court had already put on paper a decision on this particular kind of antitrust violation. He wanted to prevent or demolish the Warren Court's approach to a much more proactive antitrust enforcement. Consider that in the 1950s, our director had not a bad idea about the 1930s approach to antitrust. Furman-Arnold approach, the New Deal approach. He was not so critical about that kind of approach to antitrust. Why? Because according to director, it was, maybe he disagreed with some specific decision, but according to him, that approach was at least based on economics. It was an approach that had put economics at center stage of antitrust enforcement. But according to director, the Warren Court had a brand new antitrust agenda. The agenda of the Warren Court was to deal with issues like power, fairness, equality, democracy, which may have nothing whatever to do with economics. This is a quote from one of the very few publications by director. It's a paper in 1956 with the law scholar Levy that was in the picture before, by the way. And the other point on the Warren Court agenda was the biggest bad principle. The idea that size itself mandates condemnation. And of course, I'm a bit provocative here, writing sounds familiar, because of course these ideas are very popular again nowadays, and I will go back to this in my conclusion. So that was, according to director, the program of the Warren Court, to take antitrust away from economics, deal with goals that have nothing to do with economic efficiency, for example, and to be driven by an idea that big is bad. The problem for the Warren Court was that, first of all, the Sherman Act does not equate size with monopolization, and second, the principle established in the famous Alcoa decision in 1945 was that there was just one case in which size really mandated condemnation. That was in the case when the market share of the firm was so big, was so large, that it was an almost complete monopoly. But what to do when the market share was not sufficient to condemn the firm? According to director, again, this is what director thought that the Warren Court was after. According to director, that was the solution. According to him, the Warren Court was in a sense going to turn upside down antitrust enforcement. According to director, the Warren Court was going to behave like that. Start with an a priori presumption of antitrust violation due to size. You have a big firm, you decide a priori that you want to condemn that firm because you are after non-economic goals. you want to condemn that big firm because it's big. And because if it is big, it can cause problems in terms of fairness, of democracy, of power, and so on and so forth. After you have decided a priori that you want to condemn that firm, you follow the old style abuse approach. What was the abuse approach in antitrust? Was the idea of looking for an abusive practice by the big firm that was capable of automatically validating a Section 2 condemnation. That was the approach of the Warren Court, according to Director. And this is where, in a sense, our story starts. Because Director was perfectly aware that the abuse approach had been abandoned in the past because it was flawed, because it was based very often, I would say practically always, on faulty economic basis. So Director had a very specific game plan. His game plan against this approach by the Warren Court was like that. What is the pillar? What was the pillar of the abuse approach? According to Director, the legal pillar of the abuse approach was the Standard Oil decision, probably the most famous antitrust decision ever, the Standard Oil decision in 1911. That, according to Director, was exemplary of a shallow treatment of allegedly abusive practices, unconstrained by rigorous economics, blind to possible efficiency defenses, and loosely blending a size-based presumption, Standard Oil was bad because it was big, with a superficial account of alleged abuses. This is very important. Standard Oil was, at the time, and still is, the bête noire of interventionist antitrust. Because Standard Oil is also the decision that established in antitrust law the rule of reason against which the Warren Court was devising its agenda of per se automatic condemnation. So one would imagine that Standard Oil was a decision that a Chicago scholar who wanted to contrast the agenda of per se automatic condemnation would defend against the Warren Court. Quite to the contrary. That's why I wrote Sacrifice the Queen, like in chess. Quite to the contrary, Director realized that by dismissing Standard Oil, you would weaken the approach of the Warren Court, because the Standard Oil decision was crucial to the abuse approach that the Warren Court wanted to renew and to apply once again to antitrust. And so Standard Oil had to go. And Director wrote in that 1956 paper, let's try to apply price theory against that specific decision. And of course, this is where John McGee entered the scene. John McGee, in 1958, in a paper published in the very first issue of the Journal of Law and Economics, which in a sense gives you also a sense of the importance of that paper for the Chicago approach, McGee wrote a Director-inspired price-theoretic demolition of the economic rationale underlying the Standard Oil decision. That was the queen to sacrifice, that decision. And what was the specific Section 2 abuse for which Rockefeller company had been condemned? Of course, predatory pricing. So that's why predatory pricing had so central a role in Chicago's critique against standard mainstream, at the time, mainstream antitrust. Hence, McGee's famous argument against the basic traditional story of predatory pricing behavior. The traditional story is the one that I assume everybody knows, the idea that predator cuts price, now kills the prey, and then raises the price afterwards to reap the monopoly profit. And McGee's paper is a paper divided in two parts. There is a factual analysis of the specific case. By the way, the factual part of McGee's analysis has been proven completely faulty by later scholars, but 2/3, if not 3/4 of the paper are dedicated to this factual analysis of the factual demolition of the Standard Oil case, and then a price theoretic argument that is the real reason why the paper is famous. What was the main message of McGee? Forget Standard Oil. Standard Oil was bad law, was a bad decision, a wrong decision. And if you forget Standard Oil, even in a case so famous and so important like Standard Oil, this means that unilateral abusive practices are not such a big deal. So courts should not look at them to deliver automatic condemnation of big business. There is no automatic rule. There is no automatic way to condemn a big business because of some unilateral abusive practice. At most, you should look at each case by case, but there are no automatic rules. Was this at first attack against the Warren Court successful? Not at all. It was completely a failure. This is something that it is not always considered in those who reconstruct the history of American antitrust. For more than 20 years, American courts ignored McGee's critique and all the rest of Chicago scholars' critique against the Warren Court way of doing antitrust. And the courts went on with their abuse approach against big business, produced a long list of automatically exclusionary practices. So in a sense, director's pessimism in the 1950s was in a sense validated. In the meanwhile, other Chicago scholars, and also McGee, refined McGee's argument against predatory pricing stories, adding other elements. What you still find in industrial organization textbooks, intermediate textbooks, maybe not advanced one, but intermediate for sure. So takeovers, customer help, financial markets, the recoupment argument. These are all typical arguments. For example, the help that financial markets can give to the prey to survive predation, the help that customers can give to the prey to survive predation, the idea that the predator has to recoup profits, and so on and so forth. These are the standard ways that the basic story of predatory pricing, the cut price now and raise the price later, is attacked and is criticized, even in modern textbooks. In usually modern textbooks, you start with the basic stories, then you have all these kinds of Chicago critiques, and then there is a third part of the modern way to handle with predatory pricing. The goal of these Chicago scholars was still the same: dismiss predatory pricing, and if you manage to dismiss predatory pricing, the whole of Section 2 case law would collapse, because predatory pricing is the pillar of the Standard Oil case, which in turn is the pillar of the abuse approach. So it was a very specific strategy focusing on predatory pricing, which, I repeat, by the way, it was not so important as the strategy in itself. So, but it was unsuccessful. So, this is my second to last slide. Raise the ante. Bork, in 1978, wrote this classic book in the Chicago Approach to Antitrust. And the standard story is that it was Robert Bork, with this book, especially with chapter 7 of that book, that eventually persuaded the, of course, changed Supreme Court, and much more politically and perhaps ideologically favorable to the Chicago school, Supreme Court, the Burger Court, to get rid of predatory pricing and of the whole abuse approach. I think this is fairly correct, and I don't want here today deal with it was more the theoretical argument or the political, the ideological. I've published elsewhere my views on this question. My point here is how Bork put forward and made progress with respect to McGee. Well, Bork in chapter 7 is in a sense, it's surprising, because in that chapter, Bork does what looks like a suicidal approach to the problem, because Bork endeavors to show that all abusive practices can be predatory and so automatically exclusionary. Bork explicitly says that even non-price predation exists. Even distribution can be predatory. So Bork seemingly wants to enlarge the realm of predatory violations, which is, like a suicide, if you want to demolish that specific kind of antitrust violation. Why? Because it is again the director's approach. It's a version 2 of Sacrifice the Queen. Because what Bork does in that chapter is that first he proves that any kind of abusive practice can be predatory. Then he applies McGee's price theoretic analysis to demolish one by one the predatory rationale of all those practices. And so he concludes that the whole of case law, not just predatory pricing case law, all abusive, all exclusionary behavior case law must go, because it is based on faulty economic basis. And of course, the conclusion is you should replace this case law with a case-by-case analysis, where also big business may be discharged due to efficiency defenses. And you probably know that the idea of efficiency defenses is perhaps the most important practical idea of the Chicago School when you enter a courtroom and you have to win a case in the courtroom. And of course, the outcome was this one. This is a page from the decision of the Supreme Court with the sentence with which I started with my presentation. So conclusion. In my view, in a sense, director Bork, McGee were right, because the abuse approach to Section 2 violations was really based on weak economic foundations. So, I mean, they were not wrong in this sense. And the role of this abuse approach was really mainly instrumental, because it was just used to uphold the presumption of antitrust violation, the biggest bad idea. And so by targeting its weaker element, predatory pricing, the Chicago School was very smart, because they eventually managed to cast doubt on the whole approach. And this shows why irrelevant price predation is historically relevant. And this idea that price predation doesn't exist has been then enshrined in a long list of Supreme Court decisions. Directors' game plan, the Chicago approach, has become the law of the land, and still is the law of the land in the US. But this happened at a time when more solid game theoretic arguments were being developed to account for exclusionary behavior. So this is, in a sense, my message also for today. Because perhaps at the time, a way to contrast the Chicago approach would have been not by trying to defend the abuse approach to exclusionary practices that was based on faulty economic foundations, but probably the way to avoid the Chicago approach becoming the law of the land would have been to use the more recent and I'm talking about the 1980s, of course, the more recent game theoretic arguments that could show, for example, that predatory pricing is a real problem. It's something that really exists. So this is perhaps a lesson for today. If you aim at proactive antitrust, never lose sight of economics, or if you prefer, errare humanum est, but perseverare, etc., etc. And I stop here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Are there any questions for Nicola? Roni.
Sorry if I missed this because I had some connection problems. But why was the economics so flawed of predatory pricing?
Answer now? Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to rehearse the usual argument. I mean, if you take some IO textbooks, as I said during the presentation, they start with the basic story. Then they present all the possible ways the basic story can be wrong, because there are many reasons why. I mentioned just probably what is the most important one. Predatory pricing, in the basic sense of you cut the price now, you kill the prey, and then you raise the price afterwards, depends on the presence of barrier to entries for the recoupment phase. And so if you work on a theory that doesn't show or doesn't use or demonstrate the existence of barriers to entries, the theory is in a sense weak, flawed, in the sense that if you enter a courtroom and you have the opposing part raising the hand, say the economist of the defendant saying, hey, but have you demonstrated that there are also barriers to entry? If you have not demonstrated this, you're going to lose this case if you are, the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission. Okay, but if you, for example, adopted a game theoretic approach, you can win that case even if you don't show the existence of barriers to entry. And by the way, I didn't mention it in the presentation, the basic results in game theory about predatory pricing are dated 1982. So it's not something that is, it's 40 years, okay? So, and it was exactly at the time, a few years later than Robert Bork had published his book, by the way.
Any other questions for Nicola? Maybe I ask you a question, Nicola. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the motivation that the economists from the Chicago School had?
Yeah, this is a nice question, because of course their self-proclaimed motivation was, as it was maybe in the second slide, we don't want antitrust enforcement to be separated from good economics. At least at the time of Director, for example, Director, this is something a bit surprising, approved the Alcoa decision, which was not something that you should expect from, if you think of a Chicago scholar, or of course it would have been, it should have been against the Alcoa decision that condemned a big business just because it was big. But Director said, I like this decision because it is based, it was maybe the first decision expressly based on the economic notion of market shares, concentration, and so on and so forth. And so, in a sense, the official way, I guess, Chicago economists would have answered you would have been, because I want antitrust to be based on good economics. And so if it is based on good economics, I can accept even the case of course, condemning Alcoa that had, something like 80%, I think, of market share, perhaps even more, okay? With the underlying feeling that if antitrust really hinges, turns on economics, we are going to win most of the cases because price theory is on our side. This is, in a sense, the official explanation. Then, of course, you can say that they were doing this because of ideological reasons, because of political, or maybe because they were financed they got funding from big business. There are several stories in the paper that I mentioned, that I've published. I mentioned, I think, 11 or 12 possible explanations of the success of the Chicago school. I don't remember anymore how many they are, but because, of course, and maybe the answer is a mix of all of them. But I would not downplay the purely theoretical idea that we should stick to economics, because this is real progress in antitrust enforcement. If we stick to economics and we get rid of all these different goals that one may credit antitrust with, then of course this would open the other issue of what the antitrust law really said, why it was passed in 1890, what was the goal of the Congress, and so on and so forth. But of course, this is an entirely different story.
Thank you so much. With apologies for Jan, but I think our time is over because we're supposed to end at 6 o'clock Utrecht time. And so thank you so much to all three presenters for a very nice and stimulating session. And I hope to see you in half an hour at the next meeting. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Maria.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Nicola, yes. Hello. Thank you for talking. I wanted to ask if you have any idea why those more sophisticated game theoretic models weren't applied at the time.
Well, the quick answer would be